I'd love for you to compare squares A and B for me. And I presume that almost everyone in this room sees square B as being lighter than square A. And I'm now going to cover the surroundings. And I'm sure now you realize that A and B have exactly the same color. I'm quickly going to go back because I see some incredulous faces, like in the front row here. So let me quickly go back. I promised that I didn't do anything to B. This is, of course, an illusion, but an illusion that's illustrative because we argue that it's not just checkerboards that force you to make sense of the patterns that you see, but also the generic environment that you live in. If you don't see many male nurses, you don't associate nursing with men. If you don't see many women engineers, you don't associate engineering with women, right? We tend to put not just these little squares here into some logic, but also people. And the second reason I'm going back here, not just to gain your trust, but also to suggest to you that even though you now know that A and B, in fact, have the same color, you're not able to do justice to B. Right? Just raising your awareness just won't be enough. But in fact, I'm doing something much more structural. Right? I am basically disabling your mind to see a pattern. And now that you're liberated, you can actually see B for what it actually is. We still don't use data enough to evaluate whether what we're doing is actually working. Does it have an impact? Or are we just copying what other companies or other public sector organizations, other universities are doing? And that's kind of the core of my research. So I wanted to take you to Australia here, to what turned out to be a relatively simple study. But it started with an interesting puzzle. So I got a call from one of the largest employers in Australia, and they said, we have a problem. And here is the problem. We have people apply to leadership positions, and we choose somebody. And then we send everyone an email basically saying, thank you for applying. And we're hoping that some of them will reapply because we now already have them in the pool, we have vetted them, etc. But men are twice as likely to reapply. Why is that? And so, as I said, we asked a number of questions. In the end, it turned out to be a relatively simple experiment because the two decisive questions were, how do people know that they should reapply? And they said, well, in the email, we're saying, thank you for applying. Sorry you didn't get the job. There are similar jobs at our organization. Please reapply. Okay. And then we asked, well, who do you write to? Everyone? And they said, no, the top 20% of the applicants. And we suggested to just add this one sentence to the email. So say that, thank people for applying, invite them to reapply, and say, and you were top 20%. But on the surface, this is a gender-neutral intervention. It's a neutral intervention, race in any other category. We're just adding some additional information here. Or we're decreasing some ambiguity in, could I actually be considered for this job? We were suggesting it because there's research suggesting that women are slightly less self-confident than men. And if that is true, then maybe women are less likely to apply because they are less likely to think that they would get an offer. In addition, of course, leadership is still, sadly, gendered in our minds, and we're more likely to associate leaders with men. So that was the intervention. Very simple experiment, was a randomized controlled trial, and we, in fact, had 3 treatment arms, which I'll explain to you now. But what you see here on your left is that we basically replicate what the organization told us. That in blue, you have the likelihood that men reapply. In red, you have the likelihood that women reapply, and you see that men are almost twice as likely to reapply in the general email condition where we just tell people that they should please reapply. If we add, this is the email condition in the middle, if we add this one sentence, your top 20%, what you can see is that we close the gender gap. And then we had another treatment arm because the organization was nervous that this wasn't strong enough. We, of course, didn't know it would be strong enough either. But that was very simple, the same email, but then they followed up, HR followed up with an additional phone call, basically telling people that they should please reapply. Okay, so that's kind of what I mean with counting, that we need to use data to diagnose what's happening. We need transparency to make data speak, and we need to use data to evaluate whether our medicine, so to speak, that we prescribed based on the diagnosis is actually having an impact.
So the first question that I wanted to ask you, you talked a lot about how important systems are in inequality. And obviously in a lot of cases, decision makers might care about equality or not, but a lot of people who aren't the decision maker also care about making workplaces more fair. So what advice would you give for people who care about making workplaces fair, but aren't necessarily the final decision maker who's getting to decide and design what things look like?
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good question. So first of all, I would encourage everyone to start with their daily work. Basically, ask themselves, if you're a website designer, what is on the website? If I help organize meetings, how is the room set up? Are we all sitting in one circle, or do we have an inner circle and an outer circle? And how am I showing up at work when, for example, somebody else takes parental leave? Am I the kind of person who talks badly about the missing person, or am I the kind of person who is supportive of work-life balance? So there's just many, everyday behaviors that all of us can be part of. Now, of course, I understand that there are differences in power in an organization. Not everyone, has the magic wand and can do everything. But I also always encourage people then to start building coalitions, talk to others who might feel, who might have some of the same experiences, and then as a group can bring about change. I'm going to tell you, not actually a small example, a big example of a one-person change that then really has spread quite widely. So this was not a person without power, but not much formal power. Their name is Ross Atkins. He is a journalist at the BBC, and he was a talk show host. And he literally woke up one morning wondering how many men and women he invited to his show as guests. And they started to count. And they started to count on sticky notes. So this wasn't an algorithm, something elaborate. It literally was one person initially. Then it was his little group, 5 people. Of course, they found what you expect they would find. And they started to make change happen. And then they started to talk to other BBC teams. This wasn't a formal process. Eventually, about 1.5 years later, the BBC took this on as a formal project from the BBC called the 50-50 The Equality Project, that then spread to more than 150 other organizations around the world, and now went beyond the binary gender and focuses also on race and ethnic background, particularly for the UK, and newly also disability. So that started with one person who didn't have power over, but he had power over a little bit piece and started to change that.